Hi, welcome to Ms. Richardson's U.S. History 5-Minute Lectures. This information will be U.S. Notes 5.2, Early Actions in the Civil Rights Movement. It includes information that goes along with the first section on your Unit 5 study guide. Remember, you have control over the lecture, so pause when you need to, write down your questions, rewatch if you need, and make sure you're using your study guide to help you figure out what's important to take notes on. Let's go ahead and get started. So as you learned in the last set of notes, the Civil Rights Movement didn't just begin out of nowhere in 1954. There are a lot of historical events that prepared the U.S. for the movement. But in the 50s, Americans were ready for change and they began to push for it, lasting all the way through the 70s actively and really through today. The event that's generally accepted as the start of the Civil Rights Movement happened in 1954, the court case Brown versus Board of Education. This case, in which the Supreme Court said that schools must be desegregated, so no more segregated schools, paved the way for desegregation in all areas of American life. It only dealt with schools, though, at that point. The Brown case, in the Brown case, the decision the justices said was that separate facilities based on race were inherently unequal. They could not be equal, and so you couldn't have them. What this really means is that when you separate based on race, there's no way to make it equal. One side will always be seen as inferior, so you can't do that. After the Brown versus Board of Education verdict, many others wanted to stop segregation through the court system in other areas. So the NAACP was willing to fund these cases, which they had done with Brown, and actively looked for people willing to break segregation laws in order to challenge them in the courts, because you need a case. Rosa Parks was one individual who was willing to do this. In 1955, 1 year after the Brown decision, she was arrested for refusing to move from the white section of the bus. You've probably heard this story before, but what you might not already know was that, no, she wasn't just tired. She was actually a secretary for the NAACP, and they had planned her arrest. They had planned for her to break this law. Someone had to break the law to have the court case so that they could challenge the law. As Parks and the NAACP waited for the trial, local clergy leaders organized a protest, a boycott. This was a different, nonviolent way to pressure the bus company into desegregating. The hope was that this would be faster than the courts, and you wouldn't always have to go through the court system. African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama, where Parks had been arrested, made up almost 70% of the people riding the bus. If none of them used the buses, they could actually really hurt the bus company economically. They wouldn't make any money, and that would force them to desegregate and treat them fairly. So leaders organized carpools and car shares, and with the help of both African American and white supporters. This boycott, which is called the Montgomery Bus Boycott, lasted from 1956 through 1957. Okay, world's longest bell, from 1956 through 1957. In 1957, the bus company gave in and desegregated their buses just months before the courts actually forced them to do so. So this was important not just because it desegregated buses, it also showed that African Americans could do something to force better treatment and more rights. They had succeeded. It also brought a pastor, hired to help organize the boycott, to the national spotlight. This guy, Martin Luther King Jr., he first came to leadership as part of the boycott. And think about where he went from there. I Have a Dream speech, the March on Washington, like things you know. He's extremely famous now. With the success of the boycott, the first of the nonviolent civil rights groups formed. The SCLC, which is Southern Christian Leadership Conference, with Martin Luther King heading it, began to organize not just in Montgomery but throughout the South. This group introduced the idea of nonviolent protest to draw attention to injustice and force change. This idea helped push the early movement forward. So this is the end of Notes 5.2. I hope you learned something. If you have questions, bring those to class.